Dr. Freed connected with some schools 3 years ago to talk about 9/11 because most of the kids now weren't even born that he's speaking to that has heard about 9/11. So now he's came to South Dakota. A couple of my friends have gone to New York, and he's showed us New York. So he came this week, and we're showing him South Dakota. And it's interesting the people that God placed in your life. I mean, Ruth Ann, wave a little bit. We worked together 15 years ago. We were able to get Dr. Carson and many other famous people and just people that have done amazing things. So we used to do that in the schools in South Dakota. But I'm not going to take too much time because I want Dr. Freed to come up, or my friend Greg, to come up and share a story about his life, and particularly 9/11. So welcome, Dr. Greg Freed.
Good morning, everybody. It's really a pleasure to be here. I didn't come to make the speech. I actually came to visit my friends, the Shucks. So you can thank them if you learn some stuff, if we answer some questions and do things like that. I've been doing this for quite a while. There we go. It's really a delight to be here. In any event, let me tell you a little bit about who I am and who I was. I was the executive chief surgeon for the police department of the city of New York, and I was appointed as a police surgeon in 1980 for the New York City Police Department. I served until I got promoted in 1996 when they made me executive chief surgeon. And I throw the badge up there so I can show off. Show you a little bit about 9/11. We're going to talk about, and you're going to see slides that no one's seen. Well, some of the people, since I've given the talk a few times, some of the people have seen this, but a lot of these photographs have been restricted. They weren't released to the public. This is my picture. I was a young photographer in the 1970s. Once upon a time, I was actually young. And let me go on this side. And the significance of the photo is this is when they started constructing the towers. In 1970s, no one knew that asbestos was poison. And Tower 1, which is this one, had asbestos going up to the 70th floor. So after Tower 1 fell, and they told everyone the air was safe, we knew engineering-wise by the blueprints that there was asbestos up to the 70th floor in Tower 1. Some of the pictures, actually I took this one from the police helicopter. We used to fly over the city and see what was going on, and we'd fly past the tower, and we actually flew between the two towers. This was a magnificent sight in the city. My helicopter pilot, who happened to be a police pilot, loved to show off and loved to drive us through the towers. So you'd get there, and the helicopter would sort of rumble. I took this picture on September 9th, 2001. My daughter was in law school in Brooklyn. She was going to Brooklyn Law School. And those of you who've been to New York, when you look across the East River, you see the promenade. And this was from Brooklyn Heights at the promenade. And one of the prominent features, ironically, was the World Trade Center. And no one knew what was coming. On the morning of 9/11, these 19 people boarded planes. Atta was the ringleader of the group. Now, when we look at them, they look like everybody else. There's no way to single them out and say, these people are going to kill a lot of people by the end of the day. But this was the group. There was a 20th person who never got on board. He backed out. A lot to read, but basically, bottom line was at 8 o'clock, Flight 11 took off from Boston. 8:15, another flight from Boston. Now, these are the significant things that you probably haven't heard about. Number one, the flight attendants knew at that time that the planes were being hijacked. There was no question what was going on. And on September 11th, 2001, the plan was, if you were being hijacked, you cooperated with your hijackers. No one had ever thought that there was a possibility of using planes as a weapon, and you cooperated with them expecting to land in some foreign country. So the FAA and all the people said, just do what they tell you. The third flight, Flight 77, took off from Dulles in Washington, D.C. And now the other significant thing here, and the hijackers planned it, they were all gone to the West Coast. So they all had full tanks of fuel. These are the flight plans. This is what happened. First flight takes off from Boston. starts heading for New York in a normal flight pattern, gets hijacked about here, and makes a detour. Second plane, same deal. Starts across, both from Boston from Logan, and the third one from Washington, D.C., and turns around. Now, there are questions, why didn't they send up fighter jets? Why didn't they do a lot of things? The hijackers knew how to turn off the flight recorders and how to turn off the tracking devices. But the FAA and the Army and the Air Force knew that these were hijacked planes. They didn't know where they were going. And the decision was a split-second decision as to what to do with it. North Tower is hit. This is the first tower that was struck. This is Tower 1. Tower 1 is the one with the antenna. And it was struck. Now, over the radio in New York City, and I was in a car. I was heading into the city. I had operated on 2 patients the day before, and I was going into the hospital to send them home. Over the air, we got a code black, they called it. No one to this day knows what a code black is in the police department, and I have no clue what that meant, but it didn't sound good. But then all the chatter started with the police radio, and we knew this was an attack on Tower 1. Now, I'd been there in '93. I had responded to the World Trade Center when they tried to blow it up. I had taken care of patients. I had sent them to hospitals. So I knew this was going to be a tough day. Tower 1 gets struck at around 8:45, and I turn on a siren. Everybody is leaving Lower Manhattan. Now, I'm going to talk about Manhattan. I'll talk about places, and I'll try to orient those people who don't know Manhattan. I'll do my best. Tower 1 is struck, and it's on fire. Fire department is called. Everyone in the police department, sudden response. This is Tower 2 getting struck 10 minutes later. As I arrived, Tower 2 got struck by the plane. Now, the first plane went in straight. Second plane went in sideways. Here's Tower 2 basically being struck by this airliner. When I got there, when I arrived after the siren, I parked far away because I'd been at enough scenes. I'd been there in '93 when they attacked it. You don't park in front of the building. You're in the way. You interfere with people. I've parked on Lower Broadway. As soon as I got there, I got out of my car. This was lying on the ground. This is a jet engine. This had fallen about, we'll go back to the earlier slide, including the starboard engine, leave the building to the east and north side, falling on the ground 6 blocks away. That was the engine. I get out, and this is what I see. About 3 months later, I go up to the landfill on Staten Island where they were evacuating and taking all the remnants. And I looked at it, and I saw the lieutenant in charge. I said, Lower Broadway. He says, yeah, how'd you know? I said, I saw it that morning. As soon as the towers were hit, and here's the picture of it, this is the Brooklyn Bridge. People started to run. People knew something terrible had happened, especially when the second plane went in, and they started evacuating. The Brooklyn Bridge and the evacuation here is about a half a mile from the Twin Towers. So people knew it's time to get out. This is one of the worst slides I can show you. The planes went in here. The fire was on the other side and was burning. All these people probably never made it out. You've seen the pictures of it, but it's a very graphic slide. It reminds you of how desperate things were. Jet fuel burns at about 6,000 degrees. There was no access to get out. The stairs had given up. There was fire, and the building was really starting to rock. As I got there, this is what I saw. I saw people coming down. I saw glass. I saw paper. I saw people falling, people screaming, people running, people not knowing what could possibly be going on. But if you were trapped in the tower, there was no way out if you were up here where the fire was. As I got there, as I was approaching, I came up on West Street. West Street is just west of the towers. It's about 100 yards from where Tower 2 used to stand. And I saw a firefighter who had been hit by some of the shrapnel coming off the building. There was glass. There was all kinds of pieces before the building went down. He was bleeding to death. He was literally lying in a puddle of blood. And as I bent over, somebody said, the tower is going down. This is Tower 2. I was underneath, or about 100 yards from Tower 2. I looked up. As someone said, tower's going down. And my immediate reaction was, there's nowhere to run. I was out in the cold. I was out in space. It wasn't cold, actually. It was a little warmer than today. But I was out with no protection over me. I had gotten a ride from Lower Broadway in a police van. And the guys with emergency service, they said, Doc, you need a helmet. Now, I'd never worn a helmet at a response before, but I sort of thought they probably knew what they were talking about. So I put on a helmet. As I heard towers going down, I rolled into a ball. I ducked and covered. I grew up in Long Beach, New York. Long Beach, New York had a Nike base. And in the 60s, when we had the Cuban Missile Crisis, we used to practice duck and cover. And that's what I did. I ducked and I covered. And as I ducked and covered, a low rumble, the most enormous rumble, you could feel the ground shake. Then it got very hot, and then it got very cold. And I've asked the guys, what was it? The heat was the jet fuel pouring through the building, coming out and burning. Well, I didn't get a major burn, which I'm very happy about. I got a sinus burn and some other burns. And then it got very cold, and they told me that was the air conditioning rupturing from the buildings. This is what I sort of saw. I didn't take any of these pictures. Well, it was an event that I just didn't particularly think I had to record. And people have told me that it was the most photographed event in the history. This is what it looked like, somewhat. I mean, this simulates what I remember seeing. So I was rolled in a ball. These are some of the views that some of the photographers took. This is Tower 2 going down. This is from Brooklyn Heights. This is where I was with my daughter 2 days before. This is people watching. This is down the street, about a half a mile away. And these photos were taken by the observers and by people who were around. These are helicopter shots. What happened was, as soon as this happened, they mobilized all the helicopters in the police department. At that time, the police department had 8 helicopters. And in '93, the helicopters tried to land on the roof to evacuate people. So the helicopter pilots started coming. The helicopters are stationed in Brooklyn. So it's about a 20-minute flight from Brooklyn to where the Twin Towers stood. So the helicopter pilot, Greg Semendinger, who's a friend of mine, took these photos and he gave them to me. He said, Doc, you did it, you were there. He took the pictures. So this gives you some view of what it was like from 1,000 feet, or however. Actually, it's much more than 1,000 feet, because the tower stood 1,000 feet. After the tower went down, this is Tower 2 I was talking about, because I was buried to my shoulders. I could hear, after the rumble, after the noise, everything got dead silent. I heard nothing, and then from a long distance away, I heard, "Help me." But it was pitch black. I've never experienced anything like it, and quite frankly, as a doctor, I thought I went blind. I couldn't see my hand in front of my face. I couldn't see my glasses. I couldn't imagine why I went blind. I felt, one of the ways you go blind is if you hit in the back of the head. That's where your optic nerves are. And I felt for the helmet, and the helmet was gone. It had been crushed or blown away. I never found it again. But I hadn't been hit in the head. And then I knew I hadn't seen a blast of light, so I couldn't understand why I went blind, and I started staring up into the sky, figuring, what good is a blind surgeon? All of a sudden, for about 2 minutes, there was a ray of light that came across from the Hudson. The Hudson was west of me, and the ray of light told me that I wasn't blind, that somehow the collapse of the tower had blacked out the sky. It was the most amazing experience. It's something I have never seen before and probably never experience again. But as things started to clear, this is what it started to look like. Now, I didn't take any of these pictures, but this is this is actually hours later. But here's the debris that was falling out of the tower before the tower went down. Here's what I remember seeing. And if you look at the background, I put what the air looked like that day, that morning. And again, these pictures were taken several hours later. Then came the recovery, the evacuation. What do you do? These give you some feeling for what we went through, for what everyone who was down there who survived had to go through. This is what you walked through. This is what you saw. This is about a half a mile away from where the towers went down. This is what everyone looked like. I was covered with dust and ash and smoke and whatever, and tower from head to toe. My hair was white, everything was white, my clothing was white, and the dust was about 2 inches thick. This is a view, again, from the helicopter, and this is pretty much immediately after the tower went down. But once the tower went down, then the rescuers started trying to figure out what they had to do. At the time, it was believed that there were about 20,000 people in the building. It was unknown as to how many of them were going to survive. But this gives you a view of what it was like. And I was on this street. This is Liberty Street. What happened was the police department contacted the harbor boats. We have about 9 harbor boats in the New York City Police Department. This is the Hudson River. And what happened was they started to respond. But this gives you a feel for what it was like about a half hour after the towers went down. The towers are like over here, about a quarter of a mile away from all this. Here's the guy who rescued me. This is Jimmy Cowan. He's a sergeant. This is the harbor response boat, one of them. This is a small boat. This is the launch. And they were all heading for Manhattan. They knew that they'd have to rescue people, that people would have to evacuate, and Jimmy was on it. He told me afterwards, and Jimmy and I had taken rides on the Hudson River in the past. We went out there for the fireworks, for Macy's fireworks and things like that. He and I were friends. And he said he was concerned that the dust cloud would knock out the motors of the harbor boats. They didn't. And the guys came because that's what they do. They actually put me on the deck here. This is the only picture I have that approximates what happened. Here's the harbor boat, and there was another harbor boat coming. I was right here. What happened was since the first tower went down, I knew that the second tower was being undermined and probably would go down too. Thinking about it, I wasn't going to stay around to wait for the second one to go down, and I started heading west because there was no way to walk east. That's where the tower stood, and that's where all the rubble was. And climbing through the rubble, and climbing through the waste, and climbing through all the dust, my direction was heading west. As I headed west, I ran into Bernie Kerrick's bodyguard. Bernie Kerrick was the police commissioner at the time. I knew all the important people, and I knew all the unimportant people in the city. We were all friends. And I ran into, his name is Sean Crowley, and he was a captain. And he looks at me and he goes, "Doc, you look terrible. We got to get you out of here." He looked as terrible as I did. He was covered from head to toe with gray. I said, "Well, you're really not a sight for sore eyes either." As I walked, I got dizzy. I got thirsty. Thirst is one of the primary signs of trauma and of shock. As you start to bleed, especially if you're a younger person with normal heart, you'll get thirsty. That's the first sign that it's time to do something about it. And my back swelled. I couldn't breathe. It was very hard to breathe. People ask me, "How'd you breathe through that air?" I don't know. What I had was a handkerchief. My mom always told me, "Take a handkerchief with you." So I had a handkerchief. I had a bottle of water. I soaked the handkerchief, and it was murder. It was the most bizarre. It was breathing through a dust cloud like no one had ever experienced before. When I headed over to the harbor, there's a seawall here. Those of you who've been in New York, this is down at the Battery, and it looks, the Statue of Liberty is over there. Actually, it's over there when you're standing over here. And there's a wall here, and then there's a fence, and the fence is about chest high. So I get to the seawall, and Sean says to me, "We got to get you out of here." And I looked at him, I said, "What am I going to do, fly?" Because the harbor boat was easily 20 feet down, because the tide hadn't come all the way up. What they do is they pull up, and they press against the wall. They put up a ladder, and they hook the ladder on the side, because I guess they've done it before, and they sort of pushed me down the ladder. I've met Sean subsequent to this, and he told me, "Doc, you have to either lose weight or stop doing this kind of stuff." So I've tried. But they put me on the harbor boat, and I started to go out. They took me to New Jersey, and these are scenes. None of these are me, but these are scenes of what happened. Here's both towers going. As we were going to New Jersey, the second tower went down. You could hear it, you could see it, and that's where the smoke came from, and the second tower collapsed. This was the scene in New Jersey at the Liberty Science Center. It was directly across, and that's where they took me. So I was lying on the dock. Oh, before before I forget, the firefighter died, the gentleman I was attending to, and when I described his body, or me attending to him, they told me that they found his body about a half a block away from where I was. The force of the tower going down literally pushed him down the street. However, his blood was on my pants because I had bent over him. And when I got to Jersey, they started attending to me, and they asked me, are you bleeding from your legs? I said, no, that wasn't mine. That's the firefighters. So they started poking at me because the future nurses will know that one thing they like to do is start IVs and things. And I had a jacket on that said Chief Surgeon. I said, guys, I'm bleeding to death. If you don't get me to a hospital soon, I'll die. And when you're in fairly severe shock, you can't find an IV. So they threw me in an ambulance, or as we say, a bus, and off we went to Jersey City Medical Center. Giuliani. Giuliani was mayor at the time. I don't know if those of you recognize him or not, but I'm sure you've seen him before. They told him I was killed, which obviously was wrong, which is a good thing. Bernie Kerik was the police commissioner at the time. Tommy Von Essen was the chief of the fire department. They had been notified exactly at the same time all the rest of us was, and they were up at City Hall at the time, and they started to respond as well. As they came down, they had entered a building, and they got trapped. When Tower 2 went down, they couldn't get out of the building. And the only way out, the doors were sealed by the collapse. And what happened was the bodyguard, whose name I always forget, and he'll forgive me, but the only way he could get him out was to take out his gun and shoot a hole in the window. And they broke the glass and they got out. So Giuliani was intact and he was safe. This is what it looked like when the towers went down. I was on my way to New Jersey, and this is the view from the helicopter. That's what happened immediately after. They closed New York City. New York City has, those of you who've been there, has a lot of ways in, a lot of ways out, a lot of tunnels, a lot of everything shut down. This is actually from LA. But they stopped all the air travel, all road travel, all bridges, all tunnels, everything was closed. Nobody was really clear as to what was going on. Now, people have asked, since they knew it was a hijacking and they scrambled jets behind it, why didn't they shoot him down? And we can talk about that, but you're the president of the United States, you're in Florida. They tell you there's a plane heading for the World Trade Center. Another plane just hit it. Do you shoot it down over Manhattan? This is about 400 yards away from Tower 2. This is the Winter Garden Theater. And it's part of the Battery Park City Complex. It's where not shows, but award ceremonies and other things are carried out. And I put these up to give you an idea of how massive and how far the destruction went. And this is what the people faced. This is about 4 hours after the collapse. And it's not a blurry picture. That was what the air was like looking from the helicopter. These are the rescuers who are starting on their mission, not knowing exactly what could possibly be going on. None of them had any thought of their own personal safety. This talk this morning, by the way, is not just about me, but it's about them. It's about all of you because you're all part of this. This is late into the evening and early into the next day. Gives you some idea of what the destruction and what the massive amount of destruction is about. This is a half a mile away, people coming out of the subway. Now you notice none of these firefighters were first responders. And the reason that they weren't is they're not covered in this ash. But they were there with no regard to their own personal safety to see who they could help. This is the first night. These pictures haven't been seen except if you come to hear me speak in the future. But here's the army of responders, all of whom came in to try to pull people out, to try to get people out of the rubble, out of the wreckage. 2 towers, approximately 20,000 people in the towers, and all these people responded to dig people out. It's hard to tell from this picture, but none of them are wearing masks, none of them are wearing protective clothing, none of them cared about that. All they knew was there were people there, and they were there to pull them out. Same scene, you see the white? The white isn't an artifact. That's the dust. That's the Twin Towers. I show these just to give you a feel for what people were facing. That night, day after day after day after day. These are the evacuation stairs that survived. They're between the two towers, and approximately 100 people use these stairs to escape and to get out. Again, the white coating. This is the first night. This is as the towers went down. And it was the most bizarre scene with the facade of the tower lying there just in its own, just sitting there. Part of these stairs made it into the museum. So if you guys go to the museum at all, you'll see a piece of the escape stairs or the evacuation stairs, call them what you want. This is the next morning. What they did was they mobilized the city. These are people. And the reason these are people, these are all first responder medical people, nurses, doctors, everybody headed. This is the Hudson. This is the pier. And this is 44th Street, all the way on the west side. This is a mile and a half away from the World Trade Center, because they felt if everybody went down to the Trade Center or to the area, they would all be in the way, and they would all be in danger. It was awful down there. The eyes were burning, you couldn't breathe. So what they were doing was assembling troops and groups of people to do the rescue. For what it's worth, anyone have any idea what these two things are? These are the air vents for the Lincoln Tunnel. Lincoln Tunnel goes across over here. So these are air vents. These aren't buildings. This is the next morning. The next morning they brought in, over the night, by the way, because the towers were gone by around noon, 1 o'clock. They brought in all the rescue dogs from the fire department and from the police department to try to find people. Over the night, from the night of 9/11 until the next morning, only 20 people were pulled out of the rubble. Out of all the people who were in the towers and all the other stuff, only 20 people were actually rescued. These are rescue dogs, the fire. Now again, you'll notice they're only wearing identification. They're not wearing masks. They came because they had to come, because people were involved. And you see all the ruin and all the wreckage. Here's a fire truck. It was a tremendously difficult operation. The firefighter I had attended to was dressed just like this. And some of them wore masks. Some of them didn't wear masks. The masks, if you wore them, got clogged up with the dust within an hour. So you had to throw them away. So most of the guys didn't even bother. It wasn't worth it because you couldn't breathe after an hour because the dust just accumulated. It gives you an idea of what they were facing. And it was all done by hand. You couldn't bring in a crane because if you picked up rubble and it fell, you could kill somebody. So it was all hand to hand. It was brick by brick. And they couldn't remove all the steel. So eventually they knew they had to do that. This speaks for itself. As they started bringing out people, or parts of people. Now, I have no really grotesque pictures. There's no reason to do that. But they would find bodies and parts, and they had to set up the temporary morgue. Eventually, every remnant, every scrap of anything that could have been a person was sent up to 34th Street, where the medical examiner's office is. This is what it was like doing the rescues. I think all the faces speak for themselves. The cops and the firefighters worked 16 hours a day, 6 days a week, for weeks on weeks on weeks, to try to find survivors first, and that was within the first 5 days or so, and then for months until they finally got rid of the last remnant. The fire that had occurred because of the collapse burned until January. So the city was covered with smoke from the fire, smell from the fire, and the faces of these people tell you what the people in New York City felt. I think this one speaks for itself, too. What happened was everybody who had a loved one who didn't get identified and who wasn't found would put pictures up all over the city. Most of them were downtown. Some of them were at St. Thomas's Church, St. Peter's Church, all these different churches down by the World Trade Center. They put them on the fences. This tells you how many hearts were broken, how many people died, and how many people were missing. Again, pictures of what, now these are all at a distance. They were not under the tower, because anything that was even near the tower was totally collapsed and crushed. Those who've been to New York City, Century 21 is about a quarter of a mile across from where Tower 2 stood. It's there. It's been rehabilitated. It's been resuscitated. All the windows have been fixed. It took them months, but it was one of the sentinel events when they could reopen. So some of the buildings, when they got them opened again, people felt good about it. Tom Pertell was in charge of the command. He was in charge of the recovery and the recovery operation, and he's a chief now. He's still working in Manhattan. He and I stood next to each other on many occasions, and I'll show you a picture of him next. Sean Crowley was the captain for Bernie Carrick. The recovery and rescue operation, well, the recovery operation, not only of the bodies, but all the other parts of the World Trade Center, was done almost in a military fashion. We had all the blueprints. We knew everything that was there. We knew exactly where everything should be, and as we approached it, the police department, the fire department worked together to figure out how they wanted to approach it and where they wanted to go. This is across the street, and every window in the building was broken. And this is during the recovery operation. These are some of the statistics. 343 firefighters killed, 23 cops, 37 Port Authority cops. Why more firefighters than cops? There are actually more cops than firefighters in the city of New York, but the cops were given an order by one of our chiefs to stay out of the buildings until they were secured. And in spite of the fact that the cops tended to go in and rescue people, they waited. The firefighters all assembled in Tower 1. The way a response of a high-rise fire was handled in those days, 2001, is you would assemble the group in the basement or on the ground floor of the building, and then you would approach going upstairs. So all the firefighters, when Tower 1 was on fire, assembled in the ground floor of Tower 1. Tower 2 went down first. However, this is Tower 1, this is Tower 2. In those days, the police and fire radios did not communicate with each other. So the firefighters, all of whom were in Tower 1, never even knew that Tower 2 had collapsed. So they didn't evacuate. Some of them had climbed up the stairs. They had gotten to almost the 50th floor. When they got up there, the sprinklers weren't working and the hoses didn't work because they had been disconnected because of the crash, because it was all interrupted. The way the building was built was they had not anticipated anything like that happening, and they had no ability to bypass where the disconnect was. The elevators failed to work. So firefighters in full gear were walking up the stairs as people were trying to evacuate. 2,500 people killed, but only 1,500 remains have been identified using DNA, using samples, using everything they possibly could. Even to this day, they're still identifying bodies. But there were no bodies. There were pieces, there were scraps, there was hair, there was things like that. There were 5,500 awards for death and disability and payments for injury claims over the course of the last 15 years. In August of 2016, last August, they actually compiled the statistics, and there's an ongoing cancer group. There were approximately, I think it's 5,400 cases of cancer reported in first responders. The cancers are unusual, they're rare, they're unexpected. Prostate, breast, colon cancers, lung cancers in workers. As I told you, the guys who worked there worked 16-hour days, 6 days a week. And most of them did it without protection. Now I want to show you this slide because these are not statistics, these are my friends. Timmy Roy was a sergeant, and he had responded with the bus unit. He had brought large numbers of people down and came back, and he was in and out of Tower 2 evacuating people when Tower 2 collapsed. He was killed. He worked part-time as a roofer, and he's a guy who did my roof in my house. And Timmy was covered with tattoos. I used to make fun of him and say, Timmy, come here, I want to write on your back. No room. So the tragedy is they identified his body by his tattoos. Moira Smith came with Timmy from the academy. Moira was one of the older female officers. She'd been on the job 15 years, and she had a 2-year-old daughter. She was in and out. This is the last known picture of Moira evacuating people from Tower 2. She had gone back in to bring people out, helping them out, and as she went back in, Tower 2 collapsed. This is how they identified her body. This is her shield, which is on her chest here. And they have this and her gun in the museum. Terry Hatton was a firefighter. He was a lieutenant in the fire department. His wife, Beth, was Rudy Giuliani's personal private secretary. And she and I have been friends for years. I knew Timmy. I didn't know him well. Terry, I didn't know him well, but Giuliani, the mayor, had said when they find him, notify me, I want to identify him, I want to see him. They called Giuliani about 2 months later. They said, we have Terry, because they found his helmet. All that was left of him was his jaw. Father Michael Judge was the chaplain for the police department and for the fire department. He was a good friend of mine. Those of you who actually read my book, and we'll talk about it in a minute, but he was the chaplain for Stephen McDonald. He was just the greatest guy. He was a kind, reliable man who was always there for you. He's the first casualty of 9/11 when they list the casualties. And this photograph represents almost a miracle that was performed by him. He was hit by shrapnel. He was hit by debris in Tower 1. And these guys felt it necessary. They had such love for him that they would take him out and put him on the altar where his church was. His church is about a quarter of a mile away. Each one representing a separate branch of the service. Now, they didn't do it deliberately, but there's a firefighter and a cop and a Port Authority person and an administrator. The photograph represents the miracle that happened because of Father Judge. 10 minutes after this photograph was taken, Tower 1 collapsed. Had he not been evacuated by these people, they all would have been killed. Last one is John O'Neill. John O'Neill worked for the FBI, and he was a good friend of mine. And he was a high liver and a high roller. He wore $1,000 suits, and Louis Freeh, who was the head of the FBI, hated him. So it was constant turmoil between him and Louis Freeh. About 3 months before this photo, he was involved where his car was broken into, and he lost his computer. Because of that, they pushed him out of the FBI. And in August of 2001, he had called me. He said, I got a great new job. I'm the chief of security for the World Trade Center. And he told me, we got to come down and have breakfast. And I said, yeah, when you get in office, give me a call. He had gone in. He knew what happened. There are 2 books about him. One is The Man Who Warned America, and one is He Knew. And he knew, because he had been in Afghanistan. He called the White House. He actually called up the White House, and he said, this is bin Laden. That's who did this. He had told Clinton when he had been in Afghanistan, you got to take this guy out because he's going to do something bad. In any event, he was in, he was out, he went back in, he came out. Third time he came in because he kept evacuating staff, and his office was between the towers. Third time, Tower 1 came down and killed him. These were my friends. The cross, as the guys were digging, they came upon this as a remnant. Now, the cranes were in. This is months later. As they were recovering the stuff, the guys were struck by this. And what they did was they said, this is sort of a positive symbol in the face of all the suffering and all the misery and all the death. And they said, this is important to us. Now, whether you're religious or not, this struck people as something really important. And what they did was they took it out. They didn't alter it in any way, and they mounted it. Now it stands down at the Battery. You can see it near the museum. But it stood in a special place, and people just got inspired by the fact that life goes on and people survive. This is me showing off. They gave me a medal for performance. I think of myself as just part of it. I did what I had to do. We all do what we have to do. But they did give me a medal, so I figured I'd show it. This is Medal Day. This is Tommy Pertell. Tommy Pertell was the guy you saw who handled the entire evacuation. He's the one who handled the command and the recovery and the work at the Trade Center. He's the one who you saw with the bald head who was reading the blueprints. This is Ray Kelly. Ray Kelly was the commissioner after Bernie Kerik, and he's the one who gave me the medal. And this is Giuliani and me about a year ago. Every year he had a dinner on 9/11 where he would bring back some of us who'd been out, and I assured him that I still wasn't dead. This is today. And this, I show you this because there is outcome, there is future, there's rebuilding. This is, oops. This is the Freedom Tower, and it's done. You can go up, you can see it, you can visit. It's rather commercial. I'm not particularly thrilled with it, but be that as it may. Here's the museum, and I suggest, and I know, I don't even have to tell you, everyone who comes to New York goes to the museum, and it's a very special place. The walls and some actually are the retaining walls, and had they collapsed, the Hudson River would have flooded Lower Manhattan. This, I showed you before, this is the Winter Garden Theater recovered. The Winter Garden is now restored, recovered, useful, and this is the helicopter view now. These are the pools, the memorial pools, and the tower stands here, the Freedom Tower, but they're still working on it, they're still building other buildings, and they're still doing other work, and it's going to go on for quite a while, but it's not all doom and gloom, it's not all over with, it's still recovery, renovation, and renewal, and we memorialize it because it's something that affected all of us. That's it. Now I'm going to give you a plug for my book if you're interested at all. It's not about only 9/11. 9/11 is just one facet of my life, but I wrote a book actually because I was in the hospital and I was telling a couple of nurses my stories, and they said, you got to write them down. So I did. So it's available. It's on Amazon, and it's on the gfreed.md.com if you're interested in it, and you're curious about other stuff. I talk about my training, my years at Bellevue, and things like that, and good stuff and bad stuff. And now I thank you all for your attention. I want you to all, when you come to the city, have a little different feeling about what we went through, but it's not about just us. It's about all of us. It's about all of us together. What happened in New York that day affected everybody's life, everybody's life forever. It changed the country. There's evil in the world, and there's good in the world. And you saw the crowds of good people who responded, who came to rescue people, and they didn't have to. They could have hidden, they could have gone home, they could have done a lot of other things. But it's something that's inherent in a huge number of people. So it's okay to see the 19 bad guys, but it's a lot more important to see the thousands of good people who came and took care of us. I'll open it up to questions.
Okay, before.
This is a quirky little question, but down where the towers fell, is there any distinctive smell to this day?
Not anymore.
Not anymore?
Not anymore. You don't smell it. What did happen after the towers fell, about several months after, a lady had come down there because the smoke smelled awful. And she said, I know what the smell is. I was in a concentration camp that's burning flesh. So for about 2 weeks, you could smell this bizarre, awful smell. But the dust had its own inherent awful smell. You couldn't breathe. It was this fine, fine powder. What they did was, when they did an analysis of the powder and they put it under the microscope, the only thing that was even comparable in terms of the fineness was Mount St. Helens. That's how fine it was. Now, I'll point out some of the danger or some of the stuff that happened. There was not, now, every tower, both towers had fluorescents on every floor. Every fluorescent has mercury in it. There was not a single fluorescent bulb found intact. Every desk has formaldehyde in it. There was not a single desk found intact. And every computer, in those days they had the fat screens, had about 2 pounds of lead in it. There was not a single computer found intact. So all of that mix was in the air, and that's what the guys were breathing. You know, I'm happy to say I didn't do 16 hours a day. I was down there multiple times, but I wasn't there as much. I wasn't exposed to all this stuff. But our guys, the police, the fire, the rescuers, were exposed to this constantly. The dust was so bad that when you went down there, it would accumulate up to your knees in your clothing. And they had baths that would wash your feet. Sometimes you would get a hazmat suit, sometimes not, because there were just not enough of them. But they would wash your feet, you'd hose them off, or you'd change your clothing because they didn't want you bringing this stuff home to your kids and to your family and stuff like that because this stuff was as toxic as it gets. So the early reports that the air was safe to breathe, the air wasn't even safe to eat. It was really that bad.
So did they take the cleanup? Did it go to some lined waste disposal, like with a lining so the lead and everything wouldn't hit the groundwater, or did it get mostly washed into the river, or what happened?
They would wash it with the sanitation trucks that they used to clean the streets 3 times a day, and that's all they did. So the stuff eventually dissipated, either blew away or they washed it into the East River, into the Hudson River. But there was no specific. There was so much of it that you couldn't put it in dump trucks, and you didn't know where to put it. All the big stuff went to the Staten Island landfill. It was all in Staten Island. That's where I saw the engine.
Would you care to show or share what kind of injuries you sustained?
Yeah, I got hurt. I could complain all day, but I got all my ribs crushed. I got my back smashed. I was bleeding. I couldn't breathe. I got my head crunched a little bit, but and I got a big burn from the heat from the jet fuel in my sinuses that caused all kinds of complications in the future. So I had sinus abscess and things like that. But I'm not here to complain or to even ask for sympathy. I'm here to remind people of what went on and to share with you people exactly what it was like and the fact that we're all in it together.
Hey, you may not know for sure, but what percentage of the 343 firefighters was in the basement of the #1 tower when it went down?
I don't know what percentage were it actually was the ground floor, not the basement. But they were, almost all of them were killed in Tower 1. It was really, because that's where they had responded. In fact, the high command of the fire department were all down there. So all the chiefs, all the captains, they were all wiped out. They had never, ever experienced anything like this. The highest commanding officer afterwards was a lieutenant. The fire commissioner was with Giuliani, as was the police commissioner, so they survived. But all the bosses were in the base of the tower.
For protocol, for the hospitals and for the firefighters, did it obviously changed, and what were those changes?
You're talking about the injuries?
No, for protocols, so like when they would bring in people with mass destruction like that, how do they proceed with that?
Well, now what they do is, in terms of mass injuries, is, again, they did it starting then. Giuliani managed to do it. What they did was they assembled in a distant site, and they would notify every hospital cleared out their emergency room. So all the emergency rooms were empty, waiting for survivors. There were no survivors, hardly. There were only 20 people pulled out. And actually, in terms of me, there were only 400 people admitted for more than 48 hours to the hospital. Most of the people were killed, and there were only a very small number of us who actually spent any time in the hospital. The worst injuries were the jet fuel that burned the people, and they ended up with 3rd and 2nd degree burns, massive burns. Some of them went up to the burn center. But each hospital was designated as to what it was going to receive. And the hospitals, not only in New York City, but in New Jersey and in Staten Island and in Long Island, were prepared to receive people with the expectation, and it was wrong, that there would be a lot of survivors, and there weren't. So what they do is it's the same sort of thing. In a mass casualty situation, you empty the emergency rooms, you notify all the places. But the biggest change after 9/11 was that the police department and fire department radios talk to each other so they can communicate. But that was never even thought about. People never even considered that. The other change is, if they hijack your plane, fight them. Don't sit and do it. And they didn't know that until the 4th plane, which was attacked in Pennsylvania. And by then, they knew that this was going to be an attack, and the word went to fight them. And that's how they prevented hitting the Capitol or the White House or whatever it was. But the first 2 planes, the hijacker said, just sit still, you'll be okay. They knew what was going on. The other thing is, in that first picture, they used box cutters to hijack the plane, because you couldn't bring a gun on a plane, but you could get on with a box cutter, and now you can't.
I didn't originally know about the 20 survivors, but are you the sole first responder surviving?
Who survived? No.
Were there other first responders that survived?
Most of the first responders survived if you were outside.
No, I
But-
mean of the 20.
Well, I pulled myself out, so I was different. I wasn't pulled out of the rubble. I actually had to dig myself out of the rubble. But in terms of the 20 people, they were literally dug out of the wreckage. One of the people I worked with, her cousin was a firefighter, excuse me, and she went down there that night, and he was one of the only first responders who survived. Most of the first responders were outside and weren't killed, but those were the numbers of the people who were. The big loss were young people who worked for Cantor Fitzgerald. The picture with them above that smoke was probably Cantor Fitzgerald employees. They were all young. They had all left that morning to go to work. I'll see you later, dear, unless I don't. No one expected this. And they were all young entrepreneurs. They were working for investment companies. They all had big mortgages in New Jersey. They all had obligations. They all had young kids. Moira had a 2-year-old. Moira's daughter just turned 18, and they had a ceremony for her and all the other stuff, but she never got to know her mother.
The 20 people is in both towers together total?
Total.
What?
In that ruin, total, 20 people out of that rubble, and that was it,
From both towers.
from both towers.
Were you able to continue your practice?
I stopped on September 10th after I took out 2 gallbladders, and I never resumed surgery. And I was a consultant for a while. I found it, I broke my back, and it was hard to stand. And I don't think anyone wants a surgeon who doesn't want to stand and pay attention. So I thought it was sort of a signal to stop. And I became a consultant for a while. Then I had complications. I was in and out of the hospital for a while. And I stopped, and I do other things. I wrote my book, and I play, and I have great times, and I work with Elaine, and we long distance communicate, and we do stuff like that, and I travel, and I can't complain. Life's good. You know, I'm happy to brag. I survived. You know, I made it. I don't consider myself a hero. I consider myself someone who did what I'm supposed to do, and that's part of the contract. When you take a job in medicine, you do that. All of you people know what you have to do in life. Someone's in trouble next door, you go help them. Simple enough. That's what life's about. That's why, otherwise you wouldn't be here in church, and you wouldn't be here caring about people. And that's what it's all about. You know, there's no written law that says you know, it's going to be easy, but you sure enough got to do it. I'm telling Timmy, who did my roof, you know, he responded because he had to.
So about 9/11, we did a presentation, and I have several friends who have been a part of 9/11, but not in 9/11, but were in New York at the time, and they could hardly even talk to me because they were crying. And they watched the video conference that we did, and they wondered how he was able to talk like this and not have PTSD and those types of things. And so how do you do that?
When you're a surgeon, you deal with tragedy. You see people die, you see people bleed to death, you tell people they have cancer. You tell them that this may kill them, and you put it at arm's length, and you see it in the reasonability of what life is about. No one gets guarantees about anything, and it's, I think, the same thing with me. I can see it for what it was worth. I can see it what it did. Obviously, it affected me. It changed my life. It changed my career. It changed my ability to operate, but it also changed my outlook. And I think each of us who goes through tragedy, you either let it win or you beat it. And I think I beat it.
So one more thing, does anybody have any questions? I want you to just real quick, tell them about your presentation in Long Island at the school and the 15-year-old girl. Tell them about that story, because that gives me goosebumps.
This has nothing to do with that. Well, it has a little to do with 9/11. I grew up in Long Beach, Long Island. If you read my book, you'll see I had a good time in Long Beach. Long Beach is on the very South Shore. And one of the things I do now is I come and I talk to students, and we talk about anything they want to talk about. And they ask me about becoming a doctor and becoming a nurse and all these things. And I said to the kids, one of the important things you could do, even at your age in high school, is learn CPR and learn first aid. A few of the kids thought that was a good idea, and last summer they took CPR and first aid. One of the kids told me that over the summer her father collapsed, had a heart attack in the house, and she did first aid, and she did CPR, and she resuscitated him. And the wife called 911. When the ambulance got there, they said, based on his rhythm and based on the amount of damage he had, if she hadn't learned it, he would have died. So what she did was she saved not only her father's life, but she saved the family, the father who's still alive and still well. So she told me this, and I said, well, I guess it's all worth it. It's really a pleasure talking to you, all of you. You know, if you got a feel for what it was like, I didn't bring it here to shock you or anything like that. I just want you to get more of a first-hand understanding of really what the city went through, but not just the city, but everyone went through. This is America. And although you're in South Dakota or wherever you are, this affected your lives as much as ours in different ways. But it changed the way you travel, it changed the way you go, it changed the way things are. It's why when you go to New York City now, you see armed guards. It wasn't always like this, but it also changed the way people think about each other. And either you care for each other or you ignore each other. And really, this is what it was about. After 9/11, the city was gloomy. The city had the smoke, and the city was dark. But people cared about each other a lot. Everyone hugged you. When you drove in, and I drove in multiple times. I actually had a cop driving me around because I couldn't drive, but she would drive me in, and people would wave to you. They'd hold up signs, thank you. It was just that simple. And, you know, the other thing that happened was all these conspiracy theories, none of which are true. You can re-examine it. You can say that anything you want because you can't go back and look. But these didn't blow up. And these weren't done by George Bush. And they didn't kill all these people because America wanted to do this. This was done by evil people who had the wrong direction in their minds and their lives. Is it understandable? I don't understand why. It makes no sense to me. It never did. But it happened, and we go from here. You know, people hurt people. On the other hand, more people helped people. And really, that's what it's about. It's not about the bad guys. The bad guys will always be there. It's about the good people. And that's what 9/11 was. It was about these heroes who, at the risk of their own lives, not even knowing what was going to happen, came in to save and to help people.
I find this extremely interesting. We didn't have a TV in those days, and so I didn't see these pictures or pictures of 9/11 probably a year or two later. You know, and I had been watching a video, and I said, wow, and that's what it looked like. Well, one of my brothers was one of the first responders at 9/11, and he was part of the Type 1 team in the Forest Service, and so they were the first ones on the mound, is what they called it.
We call it the pile, actually.
The pile,
Yep.
Yeah. And being the only engineer in the group, he was given the job of surveying the whole thing. And he stayed there for a month or more, and he was part of the dispatch team in the Type 1 team that provided all the supplies that the people who were working the pile had to take care of. And, you know, he would put a call out to different companies and say, you know, we need this supply, we need boots.
Generators, foods, yep.
The guys who were up there on the pile trying to clean it up, their boots would just be torn to pieces because of the metal. And so they'd put a plea out, we need boots. And one of the things was, we need Vicks Vapor Rub. And the guys would put that on top of under their nose so that they couldn't smell what they were smelling. But just different things, but how people rose to the occasion, which we always do. We can watch in Houston, we can watch in, you know, these hurricanes. People want to help. People are there to be a part of trying to help and change what's going on. And anyway, the experiences that he had during this time, this is very moving because it gives me a little bit more glimpse of what he had gone through. He became very close to the first responders, to the fire people and police department, because they had to work so closely together to try to help take care of all the needs that were there. Anyway, I just want to thank you very much for coming, because it has helped me, and it's very encouraging that, our country is a great country, and we do have enemies, but we stand strong together.
I really thank you for that. And I think that's what it's about. It's really about, it's not about the bad guys. It's really about the good guys. And there were, the first week, we had 14,000 responders from all over the country. People on September 12th got into buses from Oklahoma and from North Dakota and from South, and from everywhere, from Texas, from South Carolina. They would come up, and you'd see these hordes of people who came up to help. I wasn't there. I didn't get out of the hospital until the following week. But by Monday morning, I had to go down there. They asked me to come down, and I couldn't breathe. But somebody dragged me down there, and I did what I had to do, and I was still responsible. And there were just hordes of people, none of whom just attacked it, none of whom did until they were told what to do, and they stood by, but we're here to help you. Home Depot sent in every generator they had in the entire metropolitan area so they could relight the place. A good friend of mine, who happens to live in Florida now, was the chief engineer for Ericsson. And he went on September 11th from Poughkeepsie, New York, which is about 80 miles, 70 miles, something like that. He drove down with an antenna so he could start restoring communication. The feds sent in troops. There were troops everywhere. And it was really a mystery, but it was an organized mystery. Now, no one knew exactly what to do, but they did it, and it got done. And it took them forever to get it done. It took them, like I said, they poured water on it from the Hudson continuously until January, when it finally went out.